live, just like that. He already synced it. So
you did the boom. Nice.
Did the boom. Just for you, Jayse. Apparently he likes it. So we're here with Andi Sharma. Thank you for joining us. You are a senior analyst with the Government of Manitoba Northern Healthy Foods Initiative. A little bit of a mouthful.
Yeah. Just a little bit.
Researcher of social enterprise, poverty, and world food systems. You've presented your work all across the world, including Tedx Talks and National Geographic. Recently became a pilot. I thought that was really cool. And has been awarded many accolades, including the Lieutenant Governor's Award for making a positive difference in the community. So a person of many, a diverse background and a lot of different things that you're involved in. So maybe to start us off, how and why was the Manitoba Northern Healthy Foods Initiative created, and what drew you towards the cause?
Okay, so the Northern Healthy Foods Initiative is a government program. It's been operational for over 10 years now. So I only recently joined 5 years ago. And
Recently.
Yeah. And it came out of a report, a study that the province undertook looking at northern food prices, which, as you can imagine, the report said that they are astronomical and we need to do something about getting healthy food into the north. So the NHFI was born. And what drew me to it, honestly, this isn't a good answer. Out of my master's program, I was just looking for, because it's a public administration master's, so I was looking to get into government. And it just happened that this position opened up and it aligned, and here I am 5 years later.
So NFHI, that's short for the
Northern Healthy Foods Initiative, yeah.
Okay. So what does where does the North start in terms of Manitoba? Like where's the border in terms of that agency, and where's the cutoff of it?
Right, so it's provincially legislated, so there's an act or a legislative, granted legislative authority that says it covers about 80% of the province, and it's a really interesting line because it goes up and down and around communities, and it's all it's not very clear cut, but I always say it's Peguis. Do you know where Peguis First Nation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So north of Peguis and all the way up to Brochet, Lac Brochet, Church to the end.
It's a large part of Manitoba, just in general, that it's covering then.
Yeah, 80% of the landmass of Manitoba.
And so so this is to get healthier foods, essentially more available to that part of the province, right? Mm-hmm. So what, before this initiative kind of took place, what did it look like up there in terms of nutrition and food that these people were eating on a daily basis? Right.
So this story starts hundreds of years ago, I guess, probably millennia if you're really looking at it. Indigenous food systems have existed for time immemorial. And so before the colonizers came, it was very sustainable and very much tied and connected to the land. So things like hunting, fishing, trapping, all the sort of living off the land things. And then after colonization, when the indigenous peoples were moved into reserve lands where it wasn't as productive, or maybe their herds weren't running in those places, it became a lot more difficult to access healthy foods. And also, colonizers brought with them a totally different diet, so started introducing things like flour and other things. And so you skip ahead hundreds of years, and you now have for lack of a better word, it's the capitalist aspect of food in the North. So there's very little in terms of retail outlets, but you have major suppliers, and they're great. It's awesome that they're taking the initiative to provide food in the North, but it's really all about the bottom line, which as it would be for a company. So they look for long shelf life, which means no fresh foods, and not very healthy because packed with preservatives or other sort of things that aren't very good for us. So you get a whole bunch of things all creating to the situation where lack of access is particularly difficult, and then what you do have access to isn't generally nutritious very much, yeah.
So what are the biggest barriers or issues that you see in the North in terms of getting this healthy food? I mean, including that access, but is it also the education portion of it? Is it also sort of the community base? What are some of the other things entailed in it as well?
The barriers there's so many, and things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. First of all, the geographic isolation, first barrier, because that means transportation costs are astronomical to get the food to the North, especially if you're shipping up things by plane. A lot of the communities are there's only winter road access or fly-in only, so when the lakes freeze up, you can drive things in. Otherwise, it's by plane, so there's no roads, so it gets pretty incredibly costly at that point. Other barriers include social barriers. So a lot of these communities, they're so far north and there's not a lot of economic opportunity in the north. And so sometimes communities can be up to 80, up to 100% unemployment in these communities. So you have no work, so no dollars coming in, and then you also have these crazy, like it can be $20 for a head of lettuce, or I saw $100.
$20 for a head of lettuce?
$20 for a head of lettuce. It's crazy. Watermelon, forget it. That's like, you're looking at $100. $100 for 2 jugs of water. You know, it's, and if you don't have a job at the same time, you know, it's compounding effects. So those are 2 pretty major barriers. The north isn't conducive to large-scale agricultural production, and so big farming isn't really what you're going to be able to make work up there. So that's, again, the land is fertile, and it's beautiful, and it's bountiful, but it's just not in the same way as you would find it in like our agricultural production in the south. So
it's interesting because I would have thought that things like hunting, trapping, fishing would have been still a large part of the culture up north because foods are so hard to ship out there. So it's interesting to find that there is this more reliable source of like refined foods and preservatives going up there. And before I even, like, I watched your Tedx talk, which was in Saskatchewan, right? In 2015, I believe. And I found it super interesting that, like, Northern Manitoba especially has what is the highest incident rate? Is that in Canada for obesity among children?
Type 2 in children, yes.
Wow, okay, that's crazy. So is that purely because, would say, like, because back in the day, 100 years ago or centuries ago, these people would have been hunting and fishing. So I feel like a large part of their food source would have been like in meats and fish and stuff like that, and the switch to say like carbs and wheat and flour and stuff like that, I guess they have bodies that are not used to it, right? So they respond especially poorly to that. Would you say that?
Absolutely. I would say that nails it. Part of the issue and the reason why those practices are now being reignited in communities in the north was part of the colonization process. That whole campaign was to strip them of their cultural identity, right? And like assimilate them into colonized culture. So yes, the hunting and the fishing and the trapping, that all came to a pretty brutal end, and particularly around the residential schools. So the Kukums and the grandparents and the parents had those skill sets, but then the children were taken away from them to be put into residential schools, and then you get this brutal interruption of that intergenerational skill transfer. So that's why we see it's coming back in communities in the north, but that's why it didn't have that strong foothold that it used to have.
So then what does your research focus on, and how are you working on affecting change in the north? And what are maybe some of the things since you became involved in this initiative that have come about and started this change?
So I always say it takes a suite of policy responses, not even just policy response, but because I'm in the public sector, to address a major social issue like this. So you need things like frontline responses like food banks. That would be for immediate situations, but then you can have medium-term solutions as well. You should have medium-term solutions. So that's where I think NHFI is really positioned in that medium to long term. And you get things like backyard gardens and greenhouses and introducing livestock, so poultry and that kind of thing. Bees are really huge in the north right now, actually. But then you also need that really longer-term horizon, and I think that's going to come when we can develop economic opportunity around food production in the north, because that's how we're going to build sustainability into these processes. So one of the really cool things that came out of NHFI, I think it's relatively innovative, especially for government, was the social enterprise, this notion of social enterprise. So it operates at the intersection of, like, you know, public, private, and nonprofit, and you have your triple bottom lines. And so providing employment around food production in the communities, but also supporting culturally appropriate access, that sort of thing. So we recently started funding that, I would say 4 years ago. So I think that shows the most promise.
Yeah. One of the things that I think about, my schooling was in recreation management and community development, so a lot of these seem to be tied in. One of the terms that I liked the most was the hand up as opposed to hand out mentality. So between that and then I'm trying to think of the other side, but that seems to be something that can definitely help. And it was the systemic change that you talked about as being something pivotal in actually creating change in these communities. So what is the best way forward for us to start, supporting these initiatives? And I think it's great that we have all these people at the table and talking, at least, is sort of one of the great things. So more of that, obviously, but what are some of the other things that we can do to help the situation in the North?
You said you watched the TED Talk, hey?
Yeah.
That's something that I really am a champion of, even all these years later, 3 years later now. Collective impact systems, where we bring all the players to the table, like you say. So the private sector's got a seat, public sector in the state, the province, and the nonprofit organizations. Importantly, at the center of it all, the community people. So actually people with lived experience from the North informing the work that we do. But you get everybody to the table, and something really beautiful happens. It's difficult because the private sector's wants and needs are very different from the nonprofit sector, and the state's kind of stuck in between. So the conversations can be quite difficult, but I think there's this, what I'm seeing now is a shift in people, an openness and a willingness to understand that it took centuries for us to get here. It's going to take a long time to get out, and we have to work together to do it. So some of my favorite conversations have been listening to CEOs of places like Maple Leaf Foods, talking to an elder from Nelson House Cree Nation. When would that ever happen, right? Yeah. Yeah,
that's an amazing thing.
A big question is, why do people stay in these places if the unemployment rate is so high and if food is so or expensive and unavailable? What stops them from coming more south to where it's cheaper, probably not cheaper to live, but definitely cheaper to buy your groceries? A head of lettuce, instead of being $20, is a couple dollars. And especially when they can get a job somewhere down south.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Have you ever lived outside of, were you born and raised here? Or?
I was born and raised
here.
Raised
here. So I was born and raised in Barbados, tiny little island. I immigrated here in 1997. And my family, I come from privilege. Very grateful to be able to say that. My family was well off. My parents were both university educated, had great jobs. And we made the move across an ocean to come to Canada. And I could tell you, and as a kid, I can't imagine what my mom and dad went through to get us here. But it was really difficult leaving family and the roots that we had built, and our family's history is all there. And I there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about the ocean. And then this is 20 years later.
Yeah.
So that's the more social, cultural aspect of these lands are so tied to these people. It's almost inextricable.
It's hard to abandon that, right? For
Absolutely. Sure. But even just from a more practical standpoint, it takes a lot of capital to move as well. So you're looking for social capital, financial capital, just to make any kind of move is pretty difficult. And like I said, these people, they're coming from disadvantage, right? And it is easier to find work here if you have skill set conducive to this particular environment of work. If you're a hunter, you're not going to end up working in a boardroom like this, right? It just wouldn't, you don't have that skill set. So I think but that being said, there has been a huge influx in migration from the north to the south. And so we have, I want to say Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population in the country, but I could be wrong. We're either one or two.
It wouldn't surprise me, yeah, if we were first, yeah.
What was the process like becoming a researcher and going through school and learning about what was poverty and social systems and healthy food initiatives?
Honestly, I kind of just fell into the whole research thing. When I went back to university, finally finished my undergrad, I went into my master's, and then that's what you're trained to do, I guess. And then I just kept doing it because that was the skill set that if I had gone to learn how to fix engines, you know what I mean? It's just all I knew how to do. That was the skill set I was given. I guess part of the journey of becoming a researcher was just embedding myself into whatever it was that I was researching. I think that was really important part of developing that skill set. I don't know. It's an interesting question because I did just fall into it. It wasn't like I just I wanted to grow up and be a researcher.
What did you want to do when you were growing up?
I wanted to be an astronaut or a sniper.
Nice.
So
a sniper from space?
Yeah, maybe one day. There's the Space Force now in America, right? So
why a sniper?
I don't know. I have no idea where that came from.
The astronaut, I get. I wanted to be an astronaut
typical,
too.
Right?
Yeah, very
normal
typical.
kid things. Yeah. I remember my mom. She'd be like, when you came home and said that, I thought maybe I should watch you.
Keep your eyes out a little bit. That's interesting in the fact that I think a lot of times when you go into university or you go into post-secondary education, you go into something that interests you. I went through a similar time of, I took U1 at the U of M because I had no clue what I wanted to do, but I got injured playing football when I wasn't in school and decided it was time to do something. It was time for a change. It was time to actually go to school. And so I took courses out of interest, and it was a lot of English and arts and things, but I knew I didn't want an arts degree at the end of the day, because there's always there's kind of the stigma that comes along with it, that like, you know, your Starbucks barista has the arts degree or what have you. So it was then, you know, what am I passionate about? What am I interested in? And I knew it was the physical activity aspect was something that I felt that I could be effective in, but I knew I wanted sort of the more management side of things, because at the end of the day, it would help with whatever I was doing. So I think it's tough to go through those process and just like that figuring out process of what you want to do. So did you find your time throughout school beneficial? And like, did you find that you drove through that and really learned a ton through your time in school? Yeah,
absolutely. It was beneficial. So my undergrad, you speak about passion, and I think that's really important, because I wasn't passionate about either of the things I went to school for. I think that was part of the problem. And it wasn't until I found food security after that spark. I was like, wow, I really want to do this. I'm hungry for it.
Pun intended.
Yeah, so my undergrad was in commerce, and I worked in the private sector for like 8 months. And this is not for me. Can't do it. I don't have that kind of hustle. Just my values didn't align. So I went back to university, and I was just like, I'm just going to do the exact opposite. So public administration instead of business administration. So, and I mean, it was great. It was a great program. I learned a lot. I developed skills, but I wasn't passionate about it. Yeah. So it's important, kids. Find something that fires you up.
So what about food security made you, where did that spark come from in food security?
I have no idea, but I've been talking about it with my sister. She's a chef, and my mom. And what I sort of have come to realize, I think, is that, so my dad died when I was 19 years old from type 2 diabetes. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand it, and also for two reasons. Like, when you lose somebody like that important to you, you just want to understand it. Like, how did this happen? How did we get here? And then also because I'm his genetic progeny, how can I avoid it? Because it's a really ugly way to go. So I think that's why it just resonated with me on a really personal level. Maybe I didn't realize it at the time 5 years ago, but now I think it makes total sense why I would be working in this space.
A lot. So is there an accolade or award that you're most proud of receiving?
The pilot's license, for sure. My dad started me off on that journey when I was 15. Then he got really sick and he passed away, and so I stopped flying. He really wanted me to do it. I'm sure he wanted me to do it as a career, but he just believed in me and thought I couldn't. Who takes their 14-year-old kid to a discovery flight? Like, you can do this. And then I just couldn't until I reached a place in my life where I could afford it. And so that was definitely.
Well, so it's always been something that you kind of wanted to do. Then it's just about finding the time and money to do it. Because we were talking before the podcast, and I just thought, like, for sure it was because maybe getting access more to the north and actually flying up there, because, like you said, it's hard to get, and some places aren't available via road during the summer, because it's only when the lakes freeze over that you can actually drive over them. So do you find yourself flying up north?
Now that I have my license, the plan is to start flying food or chick feed or something like that up to the north on just a charity basis, something that I can do for my own self. It's not going to change the broader social issue, but it's something that I feel like I can do to contribute to help. And I want to bring, so only 3% of pilots are female. And so, bring like young women, like how my dad took me when I was 14. I would like to take teenage girls or any female who's interested, really. You can start when you're 50 if you want. And introduce them to it and be like, I did this, and if I can do this, you can do this for sure. And you have more time in your life, so think about it, that kind of thing. So that's
that is something. So how did you fit getting a pilot's license into all the rest of your projects and things that you're doing?
Yeah, it was tough. It was not easy. Just fly every day after work, really. Yeah.
Get home, and that's let's just go for a fly right now.
Well, how does it work with the how do you get your license? You have to put so many hours in, right, with a co-pilot, is that correct?
So you start with a flight instructor, you go up, you have to do your private license first, which is typically it takes people about 60 hours if you're doing it full time every day, a couple of times a day, and studying at the same, because there's an academic component and a practical, the actual flying and then the theory of flying. It took me a lot longer because I was doing it part-time off the side of my desk. It wasn't my career goal, so it took me a longer. So you're with a flight instructor. Yeah.
That's a really interesting pastime.
Yeah.
But it's very useful, especially for what you do now, too. Like, it just seems to go hand in hand. That was like a no-brainer when I saw that. I was like, oh, yeah, pilot license makes sense going up north. But then they really didn't really have anything to do with one another at first. So it's really interesting how they fell together.
I know. It was a beautiful thing because I'm so passionate about both of aviation and food security. So to be able to bring them together, I can't wait to run my first cargo up north. Yeah.
What kind of plane would you be flying up north?
So I think I'd probably take just a 172. They're 4-seater planes, and I would take the 2 seats out in the back for cargo. So they're really small. The plane I fly right now is a 152 Cessna, and it's like the cockpit's the size of this table, and there's like 2 people in it. It's small. They're like lawnmowers with wings, really.
So the fact that you had social anxiety and then went on to do TED Talks, how did you then manage to shift that, like talking about getting outside your comfort zone, how do you manage that and then come up with a speech and able to be in front of people and present that as well? Yeah,
it's something I struggle with to this day. Just anything, even the award ceremonies. Like I don't like to be the center of attention at all, so that's at odds with things like getting an award. And TED Talk was pretty, I'm not gonna lie, in the weeks so you practice for months, and the weeks leading up to it, I have panic attacks. Well, they're anxiety attacks, and a lot of sleep. I have to make sure I'm well rested, and I use cannabis to help regulate my anxiety as much as I can. It doesn't always work. I can't unfortunately use it right before I get up on stage for a TED Talk. So, There are ways, I guess. It's just something you live with. I used to use pills, but I haven't in the last year or so.
Do you find cannabis is a better substitute?
I think so. Pills? Yeah, definitely. But now that it's legal and you have access to so many different, you can be very specific. I need it to calm me down rather than amp me up. And when it's on the street, you don't know what you get.
I actually never realized that there was cannabis that could amp you up. Like, to me, the whole stigma around it was that it was supposed to calm you down. So that there's these like energy versions of it. I'm like, what? I don't know how it works, but I know there's I know a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to get high, and like you don't have to get high either. You can go just for like the CBD oil, like the medicinal part of it. So there's that. But yeah, no, back to like the social anxiety. You wouldn't have struck me as someone who has social anxiety. And it always seems that way. The person who's the best, most well-spoken in the room has the most anxiety around it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because you're so meticulous about it on yourself, or so hard on yourself on it. But especially in the TED Talk, I'm like, you're so well-spoken.
I was so nervous in that TED Talk, and I missed like 5 minutes of content, and I hope you didn't notice because I was so nervous.
We didn't know the 5 minutes. I think it's funny. It's something that I think of in terms of playing music in front of people, and it's like, if you're willing to just keep going, and if you can keep the beat, if you can keep what you're doing and keep it under control, like there's that sort of improvisational side of things where it's, if you're willing to push through, if you can keep the beat going, you can get back on track and it can all work out. So it's all those things. But I did want to talk a little bit about your research too. So what is your research? What are some of the papers that you've been involved in or written? And maybe what are those entailed into?
Sure. So social enterprise was my main focus of research before. I published a couple articles on that, and we talked about that a little bit, how it's to using the capitalist paradigm, but within a socially minded framework, also an environmental focus. So I'm a huge proponent of that. I think that is a really, it's got a lot of potential to solve a lot of the world's problems because it's a holistic approach to something. So there's that. I don't know how much you want, so I can talk about a couple of examples.
Sure.
We supported, NHFI supported this farm. It's called Meacham Farm. It's in the Island Lake region, Garden Hill First Nation. And basically it was, livestock, poultry, and turkeys, large acreage of farm space, garden space, as well as greenhouse. And they were doing a lot of innovative things, interesting, but also traditional things. But the idea was that it would create employment within the community, and then the food that was produced would be sold in the community, and then it would be this like self-reinforcing revenue stream. So there's some really cool things happening in that space. As you would know, or maybe you don't, but most people know, it's really difficult to start a business. Never mind.
It's not super easy.
No, right? Like you think, yeah. So especially in a place like Garden Hill, it's super isolated, fly-in-only community. But I think it's doing well, and I think that's what we need more of. So I'm a huge proponent of that, particularly around the state's role in supporting that sort of thing. So government often supports the private industry. I know the province is always talking about attracting, especially this administration, attracting investment into the province. And I think if we could do that in the north through social enterprise, that would be amazing. One of the Canadian social enterprise that we just partnered with is called Grocer. And what it is a shipping container, like a train shipping container. And it's outfitted with LED, and it's so growing food all year round. And it's great because the rail lines that go up north, you can just ship it up there, put it down, and then it can start producing all year round, regardless of the weather. And they employ people locally, and obviously it's got an environmental component. So you can see these beautiful ways that it manifests. So that's really huge. Oh yeah, and the state role in supporting that sort of thing through policy, creating a supportive ecosystem that will enable these businesses, because it'll need a lot of startup capital, more intensive, I would think, for a place like Garden Hill. And it's risky startup, capital that you're putting in there. So you need that long-term perspective.
So how do you find like the kind of resources to start implementing these kind of systems?
Yeah, it's lacking. There's a huge gap in the economy for this sort of thing. NHFI is a small granting program. We have less than $1 million, and the need in the north is so huge. But I cannot think, there's one other granting body in the province of Manitoba that I can think of that fills that space or is in that space. So huge gap.
I know on your TED Talk, you talked about... Got you quoted
Bring
here.
in the notes.
Yeah. Was it isolated impact? You're talking about lack of integration. So social services isolated from one another. Basically, companies trying to accomplish the same thing, but they're competing against each other rather than working together.
Absolutely.
So do you have an example of that?
Yeah, and the example I always use is from the nonprofit sector. So we have NHFI is a granting body. So we put out a call saying we have X amount of dollars for increasing food security in the north. What that does is then there's maybe like 10 organizations working in that space. Now they're competing for those dollars, and they're going to have to isolate whatever it is that they do and position it to be very unique and separate from everybody else. And this is why you should fund us. When really it could take, earlier I mentioned we need a suite of responses. Maybe it's like the 10 of you working together and pooling your resources in your human capital and your social capital and everything that you bring to the table in your unique way, that you need to tackle the problem from all of those different angles. Otherwise, it just won't happen. Like, you have a great solution for this one thing, but the issue is so much more broad than that. And so the collective impact system that we have here in Manitoba, it was the first of its kind in Canada. So that was really cool, especially in the food security space. And we bring together Maple Leaf Foods, I mentioned, so they're like a private aspect, but we also have foundations from across the country, and we're the only state partner right now, but that probably will change in the future. And so you get all of this expertise and financial capital being funneled into Northern Manitoba to address the situation. So we have, like, it's not just food security people at this table. Like I said, at Maple Leaf, there's a couple of foundations that have nothing to do with food security. Their whole thing is poverty alleviation, but it's all relevant. So I think that's how we can maneuver away from or reorient the paradigm from this isolated impact. I think the example I gave in my TED Talk was Sarah's story.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Actually, do you mind repeating that for people who actually haven't seen the TED Talk?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a really powerful example. It's true. It's a true story. So Sarah, that's not her real name, but Sarah, inner city student, she always was a straight A student, showed up to class, really loved being there. This was grade school. She was grade 5 or 6. Really amazing student, had so much potential, as her teachers would say. But then one day she just started not showing up to class. Her grades started dropping, and the teacher obviously took note of that. Tried to reach out to her parents and couldn't get a hold of them, which isn't that uncommon, especially for inner city school districts. This is the way it is. So she sat down with Sarah herself and said, tell me what's going on, kid. How can I help? I know something's going on. So what is it? And so Sarah, just a kid, first thing she says was, I'm hungry, I'm not eating well, and I think that's probably, I feel sick, and I think that's probably what it is. And so the teacher, working on that information, got her registered into the local healthy food program. So she get breakfasts and lunch provided and snack and that kind of thing. So, you would think, okay, this is the problem, here's the solution, problem solved, right? But Sarah kept skipping classes until she stopped showing up altogether. So now she's dropped out of grade 6, which, that's pretty big news, pretty big deal. So it turns out that, and the teacher, of course, couldn't know this because she was operating on limited information, but the community around Sarah each had a piece of their piece of her story. So, the family violence agencies in the community knew that her dad was a domestic abuser, and there was domestic abuse in the home, and her mom had reached out to them. The local hospital, knew that Sarah's mom had just given birth, but Sarah was actually the one that's providing a lot of the in-home support as a 12-year-old child. Wow. And the reason being that both parents were addicts, and the addiction agencies knew that both parents suffered with addiction, and they weren't attending programming currently. And so, when you're not in programming, you're probably relapsing. And so there's that. The police knew that Sarah's dad had a criminal record, arrest history, and gang involvement, like known gang involvement. Sarah was picked up for being drunk earlier in the year, I think, before she dropped out, grade 6. So all of these different agencies have a little piece of their story, and in their own way, they're trying to address what they think is the major issue, just because that's the way they're set up. So the addictions agencies are focusing on the parents, trying to get them healthy, not addicted anymore, and the family violence people are trying to support for the domestic abuse. But the central, manifestation is this poor little baby girl, struggling in her life, right? And it's not because of one. Each agency could never fix the problem because there was all of them. It would take all of them to help Sarah. So that's what happened. The table was brought together, and all of those agencies were brought around the same table so they could share sensitive health information, but just speak to each other. Okay, we know they're not in programming right now. How do we get them in programming? We know they don't have a job. How do we get them steady employment so that they can continue? All of these different pieces. And once they were able to share information, got the whole picture, all of these supports were put into place in a coordinated way. And Sarah went back to school, and her grades picked right back up. She was that beautiful, engaged, healthy child that she used to be. Yeah, so.
That reminds me of so many different aspects of my schooling. In my final year, we actually got together as health professionals in a certain sense, but we all talked in a room, and we actually had a case study that was pretty similar to that. I wish I remembered the exact components of it, but it was interesting to see the different perspectives and how do we help this family and it was similar issues in the family. It was, certain health issues, certain, I believe food was one of them, lack of social capital, having positive relationships, all sorts of things. So we went, what would we do for this person to best help them? And so everybody sort of teamed up around the table to see how we could best help this person. And so it was similar. It was, let's get everybody to the table. Let's figure out what's necessary, what's lacking, and let's go forward. The one thing I've had experiences then planning and coaching for inner city youth flag football, and yet it was difficult. We provided them a meal and busing to the facility, and also coaching and the healthy meal as well. So, but it was difficult on the other side because some of them wouldn't want. We'd have booster juice and they'd be like, this is gross, I don't like this. And it's like, oh yeah, vegetables wouldn't be a big part of your diet. You're not used to this. Subway, they all wanted the pizza sub and not the, a chicken breast sub or things like that. So it was difficult to see, how do we educate and how do we make a positive difference with these individuals? And then also you have different things at play. I think for the actual flag football camp itself, it was, some of these kids didn't have the self-confidence to get out of the dressing room or actually participate in it. So it was difficult to see people sitting on the sidelines and going, well, I have a camp to run, I'm coaching, I'm trying to keep these kids busy and running around. And then the next part was, let's encourage these kids. But I think the best thing that we did were make it fun, and then the kids just naturally wanted to be part of it too. So it's interesting to see it both firsthand, and then to see as health professionals in a certain sense, what's the difference we can make. Yeah. So then what's your vision for the ideal future, especially in the North, in terms of healthy food, and the communities in general, and even populations, underserved or marginalized populations within Manitoba or Winnipeg as well?
Long term, I would like to see food sovereignty. Like, these communities have control over their means of food production, the way they run their community. Like, sovereignty is huge, and that I know that's a really big concept, and it does encapsulate a lot of other things. But food sovereignty in particular, I think, would be the long term goal. So they decide what their food systems look like, and they're not at the behest of the Northern store, what they sell, but they've now use their knowledge from their elders to teach the youth around how to get back to the land, and we're seeing a lot of that. There's a huge resurgence of that now. Just need the space for them to remember who they were and to practice it, because we spent hundreds of years telling them who they were was not good, and to strip it out no matter what. So yeah, that's the long term. One thing that you mentioned, and you're like, not just in the North or rural communities, but you're right. It's interesting that these same issues play out identically in an urban setting. So you have these food deserts in the inner city, which is where the concentrations of these populations who are food insecure end up. And even though they're in the middle of a city, they are still severely food insecure. And I find that fascinating, because it speaks to the systemic nature. It doesn't matter if you're in the North or if you're here, because the issue is a lot more institutionalized than that. Yeah.
I wish I knew how we got people more to the table. Like, I think in my own life, it's strange because I would say that I have more knowledge on people from all over the world, like immigrants from whether it's Africa or South America, or I feel like I've had more exposure to that than Aboriginals or First Nations people in my own city. I ended up switching high schools actually and going to one to play football, and it was more of an inner city school. And I did get a little bit of that knowledge and that view upon some of the issues. I mean, it was much different going from a South End school to then near inner city school, and just seeing how the population shifted, and also seeing kids go out for smoke breaks at lunch in grade 9. And it's just, yeah, you might have had 1 or 2 at the South End school, but you had half the school go out for a smoke break. And it was a crazy shift, but then it's to see that these issues persist, but then also not to feel that I had even that much exposure. There seems to be this distance that's created, and I'm not sure if it's from my side or both sides, but I wish I knew more about the issues that they face. And I wish that I'd been at these tables and had these conversations. And I know that might be some of my own unfortunate prejudice or things that have existed, just structurally too. But it is something that I'm interested in bettering in my own life. And I wish that we had that drive as Winnipeggers to just sit at the table. Let's learn about these issues. Let's learn about the background. Let's learn about it. I mean, we take history class in school, but I feel like they went over the fur trade for a long time, and they sort of glance over these issues and don't talk about them in depth and talk about how they've affected our society. And I think it would be very, very beneficial if we started to have those types of conversations, even community forums or something. I know they do exist, but having a little bit more exposure for them and things too. So do you see that as being beneficial towards helping the issues? Absolutely.
Like you, I came from a place of privilege, and it's very insulating when you're privileged. You just don't have experience or exposure to those sorts of things. But when I was an addict and when I was homeless, I was on the other side of it. And I would say that was really eye-opening, because all of a sudden you go from the one casting the aspersions on the person on the street who definitely looks high right now to being that person on the street who is definitely high right now. And so, I mean, it shifts your perspective. Obviously, we can't give lived experience to everybody, because lived experience is what it is, right? But if we had forums maybe to see, what I think is really important is hearing from people. So you now know, you sit here and you're like, okay, she was an addict. She actually came through it. And that changes your perspective now, I hope, on addicts, people who suffer with addiction, that sort of thing. And I think if you can offer space to people to share their lived experience, then we create the bridges of understanding, empathy, I guess, is really what it is. Because now you can empathize with me as a person, as Andi Sharma, this person that gets awards and stuff, but also now me as this person who is also an addict. And
so kind of creating more of an open dialogue with active listening. And obviously, like you said, you can't know to a T exactly what an addict is going through unless you're an addict yourself, but you can still listen to their story, and hopefully there can be a shift in perspective that way, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't know how we do that. I don't know how we get those disparate. So the collective impact systems are sort of trying to bring those very different perspectives to one table and sit down and hash it out and work together to solve the problem. And I guess we can do that on a personal level. I don't know. I'm not saying go and sit down and chat with somebody that you see on the street. Maybe that's a little bit weird, but volunteer somewhere at a shelter, and then you can meet people and realize that they are human beings and you have a lot more in common than you would think. And the difference between me on the street and you in your home is 4 bad decisions and 1 thing that happened to me that I had no control out of. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's difficult sometimes in those situations, helping or volunteering in the community. But then if you're subjected to a negative experience, or if you're to speak to that person on the street and you have a negative experience, it's unfortunate because it enforces those pre-existing beliefs in a certain sense. So it's difficult to have, how do we have a constructive conversation with an addict, or how do we have a constructive conversation with somebody who isn't happy to see you? I think of an example of helping at a food shelter, and there was a gentleman, and so this speaks to the fact that 95% of people or 99% of people were grateful to be there, have a hot meal. It was around Christmas time, and so it seemed that people were genuinely happy and glad to see you there. My personal story was walking into it. I got told I would be beat up for wearing what I was wearing because I was dressed for work and I'd come straight from work.
Right.
And they're like, "Oh, you must be looking to fight because you're down here." And I was like, I kind of brushed that off. But then one of the gentlemen was upset because he wasn't served, and we were going in order of table, and he was basically next on the list, but he came up and spit at one of the people that were there, and it goes, one person sort of ruined the experience for all the other people that are here to do a good thing. We're here to help. We're here to make a difference. Yes, maybe it's just one day, but we want to have that good experience too. So I think there are these issues that get involved with actually getting to the table and having these types of conversations. So it's difficult to think like there is a way forward, and I think we're doing a fairly good job, but we have to do better to stop sweeping things under the rug and actually let's get things out in the open. I think it's in terms of our own stories too. I mean, everybody has their demons, quote unquote. I've used drugs. I've made these stupid decisions in my past. I've treated people badly. I've failed at things. But I think, and it's back to that point of the social media, it's sort of the nature of what we live in is everybody wants to show this highlight, the best of what's happening. But it's only in acknowledging your own flaws that you can start to empathize with other people and the situations that they're going through. And the fact that they're dynamically influenced by their pasts and whether it's colonialism or things in terms of Aboriginal pasts. So it's so multifaceted that sometimes it gets confusing, but it really is start with the individual and get to know a little bit more about the issue and make your little impact or make your peace with it as well.
I think that's why this kind of podcast is really important, because you offer a space for people like me to come and share my story and all the other great things that the other guests you've had on, and it's a broader platform. So like I maybe would have told a handful of people, but your listeners will now know my story. And it's really important, this sort of, you're making the bridge here.
I think there's an inherent need for long form discussion. And Joe Rogan preaches this all the time, but like I 100%, of everything he says, I 100% agree with that. In a world where we are constantly just bombarded by information from every angle on our phones, at home, from news, we don't get that. How often do you get the chance to just sit down and talk with someone besides like your family? Like it's usually maybe 5 minutes at the most, and it's usually to get to the point. When you see a news story, it's to the point. Everything's straight to the point, and we don't get these long form discussions. And I think we need a lot more of that. And podcasts are kind of just the beginning of it. And I'm glad that they're kind of gaining traction now. But there needs to be something else too, where people can sit down together and just hash things out, however long it's going to take. If it's going to take 12-hour discussion, then so be it. But that's what it takes, because we've been sitting so long on this kind of just minuscule bits of information that we throw at each other, but nothing ever gets solved. And I think Twitter is really bad for that. Right.
It's like, definitely, 140 characters or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think they just increased to 280.
280,
still, it's enough for you to throw basically a headline out, and then that's your argument, and then that's it. That's all it is. And there's no guarantee that someone's going to read anything past that, right? So, I'm glad podcasts are picking up, but then again, there needs to be something else that kind of continues that long form discussion so that we can actually get to find solutions to things rather than just kind of highlighting or pointing it out, which is what things like Twitter and Instagram and news does. That's all they're really doing is pointing something out.
It's great when we finally start to look under the surface of things and just and actually sit down, have these conversations. I think podcasting, I'm glad that this came about in the sense that it felt like something was lacking in my own life. I'd had similar conversations in terms of sociology courses where we would break down into smaller groups and talk about especially sport-related issues and barriers and things. But the fact that we can have these conversations now and release them to the public and hopefully reach even a broader audience. And yes, we're, 7-8 months into this, so it's a growth process, and I think we realize that. But I think personally I enjoy having these conversations because it increases my worldview and even community view here at home. It makes me knowledgeable about more issues, but more aspects and more professions and more people's stories. And so you end up getting a really great and rewarding and in-depth view of people, which is something that I'm passionate about too. So it's interesting how we almost fall into these things, but they really stem from who we are and what we want from our lives and what we want to accomplish as well.
It reminds me of the African proverb that you provided on TED Talks. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I find that fascinating.
I draw the parallel there. I started running Spartan races, obstacle course races, and it's funny because it seems that exact thing, if you want to run fast, you could do it for a while by yourself, but there's something about having other people doing those races with you. One of the guys that I traveled with did the ultra, so it was 30 miles and 60 obstacles or whatever. And I can only imagine, and the only things that got him through, he had somebody give him some of their water from their camelback or whatever, and some food and whatnot. So it's just this, it's the fact that that community, even in a race like that where you're technically running against each other, those little fun things, or making a comment or talking to the people beside you, are the things that get you through. So that's where my mind went with it. But I thought that rings true 100% as well.
Our whole, the success of our civilizations is because we're social creatures. We need each other to make this whole crazy world work. So, yeah.
Well, in a sense, it's tough because it seems that there's so many more barriers now. Everybody has their headphones on and their phone in front of their face. And that's what we're lacking in a large sense of it. I wish I were more social in certain aspects. I think I struggle with not wanting to get in the way of people's experience of, maybe they are just listening to music and enjoying that moment, but it's tough because are they closed off to a conversation? Is there that barrier, or is it these barriers that we're just making for ourselves?
I think a lot of people are closed off to conversation now, because the extent of these new generations coming up, of their conversations exist in a very virtual world in terms of social media. And so to them, that is being social, right? But to us, that's not. And I don't think that is being social at all. Being social is working together, working in person, rather than giving someone your opinion over social media in 280 characters or less, right? Like it's interesting that we are more connected than ever, but we are probably less social than ever.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, when you put a screen in front of people, I mean, there's just those degrees. You don't get the same kind of experience unless you're sitting down and talking with somebody. We're social creatures. We read body language. We read all sorts of facial recognition and structures. So the fact that it's everything's a degree of separation. I mean, there's FaceTime, but you don't get to see that person in front of you. You don't get to see their body language. And then you just lose things as you go. I mean, Twitter is just words on a page, and it's a very small amount of words too. So it's incredible though how much 280 characters can ignite someone emotionally, right? Like someone can blow up over that. Not only that, it's that like the intent, the amount of extremism that we're seeing now because people can hide behind phones and not show their face is incredible. Like the amount of death threats that are thrown out just for someone saying or giving their opinion on something is incredible. And it's hard for me to believe, like how can you threaten someone else's life based on their opinion on like something so specific? Like it just doesn't make any sense to me. And so it's interesting that there's kind of a lost touch to humanity in that somewhere along the lines. Because if you can just threaten someone's life without a second thought, like that, I feel like there's something maybe mentally going on that person needs to seek attention or help for. And I think that has a large part of what the States is dealing with now in terms of things like school shootings and how just socially what's the right word for this? Like socially anxious?
Socially anxious, socially divided. Everyone is from one another. And just...
But isolated.
Isolated, yeah. That's a good word for it.
Yeah, you find so many populations are isolated from each other. And so many people, like within those schools, it is the people that are like stuck in their own little bubble are the people that act out.
Yeah, and more is bubbling to the surface now, because it's like this. You're putting a cork on a bottle that has all this pressure in it, and eventually it's just going to pop, right? And it's happening more and more. And I don't think we have a system capable of dealing with it yet, because it's such a new thing, and with technology evolving ever so quickly now, that we're getting to this. I feel like we're eventually going to get to this boiling point where it's all just going to boil over, and we finally have to come to some sort of arrangement that's gonna help these people, because like these things in the States, like school shootings, that like that's not something that's sustainable long term. Like it's terrible.
Yeah, we have to renew our sense of connection. I mean, we're in this new age of technology, and we have to learn. It's relatively new, so we're learning how to float the waters and make sure that we can continue forward. And that has to be part of the conversation. How do our social skills develop from a young age outside of having a screen? Like, I don't think the world should be a place where we're only using a screen. So let's help people connect and maybe figure out some ways, whether it's social forums, whether it's sitting down for long form podcasts, or just sitting down in a room of talking. But for some reason, you put microphones in front of people. It becomes this official thing.
And we talked, we talked about this at the beginning too, and even with us, like we don't have the time, right? Like it's time. There's not enough time in a day, and we're expected. And I don't know if that's a thing that has to deal with things like capitalism or like the way the system's evolved over time, and that more people have to do things like work second jobs or work longer jobs, and there's this kind of just idea, and like things like it takes longer to get degrees now, and it's more work, and it's just all this time out of your day, and where do we find the time for just ourselves, just to sit down and talk? Like, how do we find that? Because it's not something that we can just put 10 minutes aside for. It's something where you literally have to put hours aside for.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, especially in the face of not enough time. But I don't know that technology has to be a barrier to that. I have a friend, she's working for...
It should assist it.
Absolutely. She's working in AI down in San Francisco. And one of the models she's looking at is how can using artificial intelligence, using predictive behavior models, help us as the users save time in a day. So it'll make a series of decisions for us without us even thinking, because it's artificially intelligent and that's what it does. And it ends up saving us a certain amount of time in a day. And maybe then we can reallocate that to connecting on a human level. I think technology is here to stay, and it's a great thing. And I think it's important that it...
Yeah, I definitely don't think we should just throw out technology.
Yeah.
I think it's just like Riley said, it's such an infant phase of technology, and it's so rapidly expanding that we don't really know. We're kind of just rushing through an unknown sector of this way we're evolving to, and how we can use it in our everyday lives.
I think it's learning to use it as a tool or an enhancement to life, rather than like, let's not spend our lives in front of screens. Let's actually have experiences, human experiences, because that's what's going to enrich our lives and make us interesting and dynamic and diverse people. So I did want to ask a couple more questions just in terms of things that people might want to know. Is there a book or maybe a person that's inspired you on your path and what you're doing today?
All of the reading I do is like science fiction and fantasy. So I guess if you want to know the books, would be like Neuromancer and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yes.
Like those are my favorite books. And
best trilogy out there.
Amazing, right?
It's so good.
Never gonna find a better Dune. So those probably not gonna help people find a path, because I don't know, it's just fun reading. I don't read anything else other than science fiction and fantasy. And a person. Like a famous person, or just any person?
Anybody who's influenced you the most.
I don't know, my mom. She's pretty amazing to pack up a family and bring them across like oceans and work several jobs to keep food on the table. Wow. Like she's awesome. She's definitely inspiring. Yeah.
I like when you get to that point. I think it's something that I brought up previously, but you get to the point in life, you sort of hit those teen years. So when you're a kid, your parents are the amazing, and then you hit your teen years and those young adulthood, and you drift away because you want to be an individual and you want to be your own person, and so you start to figure out who you are in the world. But then it comes back around and it hits the mid-20s, or when adulthood really hits, and then you start to appreciate all the things that your parents do, and even see the intricacies of who they are and how that made you who you are. You start to see in depth of that and start to appreciate that more. And I think it's something that I start to see more and more every day and appreciate. And you go, why did you do all these things to me too? But you have to appreciate all of it, right? Like we are who we are because of our parents, which is a really cool thing.
Absolutely.
Final question, is there any advice you would share with somebody wanting to make a positive difference or change in their life?
In their own personal life, geez. I guess. Okay, so I think about the times in my life when I needed to make a really big change in my personal life and what I needed to do to get through it, and that really is like I had to realize that I was worth making those changes to be a better person. I struggled with self-worth and self-love. Like learning to love myself was the biggest first step that I could have ever done to like get anywhere else in my life. Because otherwise you just don't think, oh, why even bother? Like I'm not even worth the time or the effort, so I'm not going to bother changing. My life doesn't matter at all. And so, yeah, working on that, retraining that inner monologue that you have, from like mine used to be very dark and negative and filled with hate. And then being kinder to yourself and loving yourself. And then I think you're in a solid enough foundation to start making other changes.
It's funny, that's exactly part of my personal mantra that I've came up with recently, is just that you're worth the love of yourself and others. Mm-hmm. But like you're worth loving yourself, you're worth the love of others. But you also have to accept where you are in the moment is one of the things too. So
absolutely.
It's getting to that point. I think it's something that I struggle with even to this day, which is that self-talk. And it's something that's come up lately that was a little bit of a spark of going, oh, I really do think negative thoughts sometimes and let those pollute my brain, for lack of a better term. So it's restructuring and figuring out exactly how you can either remain neutral on certain things that happen or take a positive outlook on it. You know, don't be self-defeating and think I can't or I won't or I don't have the ability to. You really have to start going, I'm trying, I'm doing this, I'm showing up, I'm progressing forward. Absolutely. And that can be such a profound change when you start to think that way. You literally feel your spirits lift when your self-talk is positive. So yeah, getting to that point, really, really important.
Yeah.
Yes. So to conclude, where can we find Andi Sharma, your projects, and your research? And is there anything you'd like to share with listeners in regards to websites, social media, or anything as well?
I don't even know my social media names. I think if you just Google Andi Sharma, it should come up.
I know there's a bunch of things that come up for you, so you seem pretty popular on the search engine. So I guess that's a good thing. Yeah, I know one of the first things was the Bell Talks thing that came up for you, and then the TED Talks thing also comes up, and the U of W, kind of where you went. And
cool. I have not Googled myself. I should probably.
It's fascinating. I try not to Google myself either. I really don't want to know all the negative things that are there.
Seems a little bit self-serving. Just let other people write the story.
Yeah, there you go.
But is there any upcoming projects or research that you'd like us to know about?
So World Wildlife Fund, I'm going to be in the first week of December. It's actually in collaboration with National Geographic. It's in Washington, so I don't know how much. If you can come, that'd be great. But it's all about collective impact and living systems and embracing change and how we can make difference on the global level. That's upcoming. Other than that,
I would say just look you up just in terms of for people to find more information about like what you're all about, and just like listen to that TED Talk, find a YouTube, just search for your name, Andi Sharma, and it comes up, and it's only 12 minutes long, but I learned a lot in that 12 minutes that I had no idea about before. So
awesome.
You're a very inspirational person, and you've accomplished a lot, and hopefully you're going to accomplish a lot more. And
thanks.
Thank you so much for being on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I had fun. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. We're excited. I think it's one of those things. Well, talking Future Leaders of Manitoba was how we found you, and I was super grateful that we were able to connect. And also, I watched a bunch of videos, and then the people I connected with, and yours was one where I was like, I need to have this conversation and just learn more about your story and about what you're accomplishing. And then to Google and do the research and come up with notes and things, it was like, I knew it would be a great conversation, and it definitely was, and I'm happy to have you on too. So our conclusion though.
Do we remember our social?
Do I sometimes I wonder, Jayse, because we change things and you make fun of my emails. But so as always, we're Be The Change YPS on Facebook and Instagram. If you ever have any information for us or any guest ideas or things you'd like to see from the show, you can email info@bethechangeYPS.com. Much easier than the last email that we had with a bunch of dots in there too. No announcements. We'll probably have a lot of upcoming content, a lot of guest book even into the new year. Subscribe to us where you're listening, either on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, whatever else we're on.
Yeah, or just go to our website.
Or go to our website, BeTheChangeYPS.com.
You got it.
Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah,
Take care and have a good day.
Take care.
Thanks, Andy.